The topic tonight is sort of self-evident from the title slide, and just to share with you where this idea came from was that it seemed that before there were jamborees, there were really no national BSA events, and there were world jamborees to be sure, but that was a very limited audience. But here in the United States, there were no national events. And I was talking with a couple of guys on the call about how patch trading in general, and Dave Minahan's now doing a history of patch trading website. I want to get a word in on that, which I think could be a lot of fun. But patch trading, for patch trading to exist, scouts have to be in the same place at the same time. That's one of the conditions to do patch trading, particularly in those days, before even mail trading started or how we do it online now. And the second condition necessary for patch trading to exist is that scouts need to have patches to trade. And I know both of those things sound kind of odd to say that, but prior to the national jamborees, maybe to a small extent the national OA meetings in the early 30s, but they were so small and they were confined to the East Coast and in the South and the Midwest, that you didn't have either of those conditions going on. You didn't have scouts that had patches to trade, and you didn't have scouts in the same place at the same time. So swapping was always a part of wherever scouts got together, and they swapped different things. But this whole notion about gatherings and scout gatherings before the jamboree started really sort of started to take form for me. And out on the West Coast, we had these events going on, as we'll see starting in 1921, called Older Scout conferences and patrol leader conferences, where people from the whole state got together. And so that set me sort of down a rabbit hole of trying to collect the information that I had on that stuff that I had in my collection, and then doing a tremendous amount of research. So, as is typical with Patch Tales Unknown, the first 3 episodes, and episode 4 is no different. I end up learning more putting the presentation together than I'm sure anyone else who's on the call watching. It's really an interesting exercise. But we start out in the 20s. Councils are just getting started. It's hard for us to imagine. In the early 1920s, there weren't a whole lot of what were called first-class councils even. My council that I grew up in started in 1922. And I think that that's typical of a lot of places in the country. There weren't events for people to go to. The council itself in those days was the place where everybody got together. The council boundaries, in most cases, were a big meeting of all the troops. And anytime the council did something on a council level in the early 1920s for the youth, that was a big deal. But regional events and national events really weren't there to be had. The other thing, as it relates to regional and national events in the 20s, is places were hard to get to. We take that for granted now too. The interstate system for cars did not exist. That was a product of the late 1950s and 1960s. The highway acts were handled on statewide basis. The roads were handled locally, and they were not in good shape. 4-lane highways were not part of anybody's imagination in those days. So just driving places was tough to get to. Air travel didn't exist to speak of in the early 1920s. And so the only way to get from one place to another, like in California, is a pretty good sized state. And so growing up in Los Angeles, if I needed to go to a scout meeting in Sacramento, these days I could just get in my car and drive up Interstate 5, and be in Sacramento. in 4 hours if I want to be, 4 or 5 hours at best. But in those days, you couldn't get there. Trains was how people got around. And so that was the environment where collecting actually developed. There weren't a lot of patches to trade in the 20s. Some camps had patches. You know your own councils. Think about the patches from your council and your camp. When did your camp start? When did they start having patches? I know in my council, the camp started in 1925, and the patches were not something you bought at the trading post in 1925. You got a patch as an award for completing a bunch of assignments at summer camp. It was an award, like an Eagle badge, and it was treated that way. And so Order of the Arrow patches didn't exist to speak of. Jamboree patches, of course, is too early for anything like that. So people traded, scouts traded weird stuff, like a dirt from their council camp, or neckerchief slides, or of things of that nature. And nobody had dupes of anything. Why would they? What would they trade them for? Neckerchiefs were not much better than patches. When you think about it, the neckerchiefs were really centered around the troops. Every troop in our council, and I bet yours too, had a different neckerchief. And that's how troops were identified. And so you didn't trade those things. There weren't commemorative neckerchiefs to speak of. It was just an interesting environment. So a lot different from where we are now. When the BSA instituted the 12 regions in the United States in 1920-21, things started to change. There was a regional system prior to the 12 regions. I think it was 8. Ryan Bashore does a great job of outlining that in his book. We're going to take a look at that. But the 12 regions sort of set in motion an organized plan for the BSA to grow and create regional activities and filter that down to the council level, so that councils, all these new councils, actually had a program that they could do in their geographical area that had some kind of standardization with the entire BSA program. This is Ryan's book. This book by Ryan and John Coppin has been a great inspiration to me. I think it's one of the finest memorabilia and collecting books that our hobby has ever produced. If you don't have this book, I recommend, even if you don't collect these things like region patches and regional activity patches, the history contained in this book around that is profound. I'd recommend you get a hold of a copy of this book if you can. So our discussion tonight starts around the emergence of the patrol leader conferences and the older scout conferences. The earliest reference, and I think you know by now, for those who've been on here, I do a tremendous amount of work on newspapers.com. It's only getting better and better. There's more newspapers that join newspapers.com and digitize their information every month. And the website itself is more accessible. It's one of the most powerful tools anyone on this call could possibly ever have to go digging into scouting in their council, in their area, in their state. And I recommend it very highly. In searching for patrol leader conferences, the first time I saw the term used out west anywhere, and maybe in the whole country, was in Honolulu Council, of all places. Here you're looking at a newspaper article in the Honolulu Advertiser from 1917. And they have a discussion, as you can see in the yellow highlighted area. They're going to do a patrol leader conference at 6:30 p.m. Now, what that was exactly, I'm not 100% sure, but they were going to assemble the senior leaders in their council and talk about stuff. Next reference I see in my target zone, and by the way, Region 12 is the focus of tonight's discussion. Region 12 included California, Arizona, Utah, and Nevada. Those 4 states. It sort of ex officio included the territory of Hawaii as well, but Hawaii did not come in officially into Region 12 until later, maybe the late 30s or even later by some people's accounts, but while still a territory. Nevada never really had much going on. There were only 2 councils in Nevada, even in this present day, Southern Nevada, Northern Nevada, and they hooked up with California, and Reno hooked up with California, and Las Vegas hooked up with Arizona. So Nevada is really not a factor in this discussion, but the other 3 states are factors. And in 1921, in the Deseret News, which is one of Salt Lake City's major papers still today, an article appears that more than 100 boys attended a 2-day event of a patrol leaders conference. And then it goes on to describe it as an event. It was a big deal. For them, it was a big deal. In 1922, an article appears across all the United States in all the papers. The BSA did a great job of promotion and marketing. Some of the things that they did, they would send press releases to newspapers all around the country when they had national news to report. And in the early days, Anniversary Week, which is in February, of course, for the BSA, they were always pumping, the national office was always pumping out the press releases because stuff was happening in Anniversary Week. And an article came out by one of the Scout executives from Knoxville, Tennessee, where he's talking about how to promote issues and solve problems with the older Scout. The older Scout is kind of an interesting concept in 1922. Now, the program's only 12 years old at that point. Scouts that had come in the early teens that were still around and hadn't aged out yet, they were finding less things to keep them interested. As they got older, some of them went on to become scoutmasters, of course, and started their own troops and all of that kind of stuff. But there was this growing population of scouts that had joined the program in the teens, and there wasn't really anything developed for them to do. So the national office began to see that maybe they should have some stuff for these older scouts. It was a membership retention issue, as well as anything else. In California, between 1922 and 1923, looking in the papers, there is an abundance of a new idea, patrol leader conference ideas, being reported in local newspapers all throughout the state. Here's one example from the Press Tribune, which is from Lake Tahoe Council. And it talks about a patrol leaders conference and training courses. Now, at this point in time, the patrol leader conferences were not standardized in any way. Some councils did it as a 1 or 2 day event where they were talking about training patrol leaders, and other councils did it as an evening type of training event during the middle of the week or whatever. The whole idea was train the patrol leader so the patrol leader could then go back into the troop and train the scouts. It was an organizational pyramid that the national office was trying to set up. And so throughout the rest of our program here today, we're going to be talking about 2 different ideas and things that were going on simultaneously. The Patrol Leader Conference and the Older Scout Conference, both of which were moving forward simultaneously. 1922, we see another newspaper article showing up in Pomona in Southern California. It talks about a patrol leader conference being organized that will last an entire year. It will meet once a month to discuss patrol problems. Just sort of a different idea. Another article appears June 1923 in the Glendale Burbank area, which is Verdugo Hills Council. Same idea. They're talking about patrol leader conferences back that far. Also in 1923, this article appears in the Fresno papers about their first patrol leader conference. So when you see during a short period of time, remember how news traveled back in 1922 and 1923. It wasn't instantaneous like it is today with social media. It was far from it. There was no television, there was no radio. So if the national office, VSA national headquarters, wanted to get an idea out to the councils, they had to work at it to get one idea out to all the councils in those days, and it took a little bit of time. And so councils were starting to pick this up. But when we see multiple councils placing or having news reports in their local papers that they're starting to do something like patrol leader conferences, it all points back to the national office. And by 1922 and 1923, the national office is sending information out through the regional offices. And it's the regional office that's getting the word out and telling the councils and the execs what the program should be. So let's stop there for a second. We're talking about something going on with patrol leaders, but as we just spoke, there's something else going on here besides these patrol leader conferences. And in the summer of 1921, different councils within California begin reporting that they will select scouts to attend the state fair in Sacramento. Now, Sacramento, of course, is the capital of California. And like almost any state in the country, they have state fairs. These are big deals. And in 100 years ago, state fairs were really big deals. Everybody met there, whether it was they were showing off their prize hogs, or they were baking pies, or they were eating hot dogs, or whatever it was. In an era without radio, television, movie, anything, the state fairs was some of the biggest entertainment going on. And in 1921, the California State Fair decided to host some things related to the Boy Scouts. They would put up the scouts. They decided to put up the scouts, handle their lodging and their meals. But the scouts would have to provide their own transportation to Sacramento, to get up to Sacramento. And it also says in the article, some of these articles are fun, the stuff that they say. The scouts had to bring their own blankets and eating utensils. And this may come as a shock to some of the folks on the call. It came as a shock to me the first time that I heard of it. And that is, sleeping bags don't go all the way back they don't go back 100 years. The scouts went to camp and they brought blankets 100 years ago and 90 years ago. They didn't bring sleeping bags. They didn't have sleeping bags. This is an unbelievably great newsletter provided by Alan O'Connor out of his collection of the Sacramento News. The Sacramento Council, Golden Empire Council, sort of organized and hosted what was going on at the state fair, and they created the first Older Scout Conference. And it was a service troop. It was well documented. It included not just scouts from Sacramento, but scouts from all over the state. It was a regional affair, or a state affair to be sure. And here's some data on that, about the Older Scout Conference, what they were doing there. There were 62 scouts that attended the conference at the California State Fair, and 11 scout execs that came with them. So it wasn't a big thing. There were, out of those 62 scouts, there were 18 Eagle Scouts. That was a lot of Eagle Scouts to get in one place at one time in 1921. We'll take a look at that in the news of the council. Now, interestingly, it wasn't the Boy Scouts that invented the term Older Scout Conference or Older Boys Conference, as it was still called in 1921 when it started. That was started by the YMCA in 1904. The YMCA started holding these conferences for older boys, they called it. And the Boy Scouts copied that. There was a lot of copying going on in those days. This was the program, again, from Allen's collection in 1922. They went back to the state fair. And now it got more involved. Now they actually had a printed program of what was going on at the Older Scouts Conference. It was a real event. 1921, the first one, did not have a patch. I suppose it did not have a program of any type. Maybe there's some memorabilia. I mean, this stuff is so hard to find these days, and there's so little of it circulating amongst the scout collecting community. We'll talk more about that as time goes by, but it's just a mind-boggling miracle that any of this stuff is still around. So in 1922, they issued a patch. And we have our first Older Scouts Conference patch. It says California State Fair on it because it was held at the California State Fair, but it was exclusively issued to the guys who were part of the Older Scouts Conference. In 1923, the region helped sponsor another Older Scouts Conference. And this time, they put it in Santa Barbara. And so they took it away from the California State Fair and held it in Southern California instead of Central California. And lo and behold, they issued a patch. This patch, of course, is 101 years old. It's a regional event prior to any jamboree. It was worn on the sleeve, on the shoulder, on the left shoulder of the scout uniform, because there was nothing else there on that part of the scout uniform. Of course, the right shoulder was for patrol medallions and stuff, troop number. They didn't have community strips in those days. And so our first controversy begins. Where there are patches, there are controversies. And this one goes back 100 years. What's the controversy? Well, we have some good documentation of the 1923 Older Scouts conferences, and we have this patch, a 1923 California State Fair Boy Scouts patch from 1923. It looks a lot like the 1922 patch. This is a real patch. This is not this patch has been around for over 100 years. But what's it for? How does it work? Is it really an Older Scout Conference patch? That's the question. Now, it's been called an Older Scout Conference patch, but as we start to do the research and we start digging in, we start to find out, well, I don't know, maybe not. There was only one Older Scout Conference in California in 1923, and it was in Santa Barbara. It wasn't in Sacramento. And so I dug around, and for our presentation tonight, I really dug around in the newspapers to try and find any documentation throughout the entire state, not only out of the Sacramento area, that they might have been holding a scout fair at the state fair in 1923, but I looked all over the state for any council that might have sent anybody to a BSA or a Boy Scout event at the state fair. And I got to tell you something. I didn't find it. I didn't find any record, none, zero, that any council sent anybody to Sacramento for the state fair, that there was any state fair service troop in 1920. Now that we don't have all the information. I don't have all the newspaper articles. I only have what's available to me through these sources. So maybe the jury is still out on this, but at the moment, there's no documentation that in 1923, there was an older scout conference at the California State Fair. Not only do we have controversy in 1923, but we have unsolved mysteries. Where there are patches, there are unsolved mysteries. Where there are scout collectors, there are unsolved mysteries. And in this particular case, we have a great photo of the participants at the 1923 Older Scout Conference in Santa Barbara. It's one of those panoramic photos, and it's really high quality. When you blow it up, you can see, and the quality's good enough, not necessarily on the computer screen, it gets a little bit fuzzy, but the pictures themselves. And you can see these scouts are wearing a patch on their left shoulder. And when we blow it up even further, son of a gun, they're wearing a shield-shaped patch on their left shoulder in 1923. And that sort of proves up the fact that, yes, they did wear this patch. They did use this patch for the Older Scout Conference, but there's a little bit of a problem. If you take a look at the patch, and I know this is black and white, but the colors of this patch are not consistent with the patch that we know of from the event. Here we go. On the left is the only known example that I'm aware of a 1923 Older Scout Conference patch from Santa Barbara, and on the right is a super blow up of one of the pictures. And guess what? They're different colors. Now, the one on the right, we don't know the colors of that patch. We only have all these black and white images of it, but it's dark printing on a light background. Is it reverse colors? Is it blue on yellow? Is it red on gray or white? We don't know any of these things because that patch that's in that picture, and I can tell you, you can look at that picture, that panoramic picture, and you can see, maybe upwards, well, certainly over 50 people wearing this patch on the right. There's no known examples to the best of my knowledge. And so here we go. We have documentation of stuff that we don't, it's just even around anymore. There's nothing around. I love that stuff. That's why we do this. Going back to the patrol leader conferences, because remember, we're going back and forth, patrol leader conferences, older scout conferences, they're happening at the same time. And in 1923, through our research, we see that there's a wide variety of patrol leader conferences going on around the Region 12, let's say. They did happen in other regions too, but in Region 12, Sacramento had one, Salt Lake City and Utah had one, Tucson, Arizona, they had one. And there are others. This is just an example that the councils are starting to put on patrol leader conferences. To the best of our knowledge, there are no patches for these patrol leader conferences. At least nobody's ever found one. Maybe they'll show up. Maybe we'll get lucky. But Canada had something, and they were doing patrol leader conventions or conferences in British Columbia on their west coast. And here's a ribbon from the 4th annual Patrol Leaders Convention from Vancouver, British Columbia. Amazing. And what really strikes me about this is, if this is the 4th annual ribbon, that means that their patrol leader conferences started in 1920, of all things. I would hope that someone in Canada researches this. It's a little beyond my scope and ability. to research Canada and the United States at the same time. But the beat moves on. 1924, we're now looking at a California Older Scouts Conference in Oakland in 1924. It's the fourth Older Scouts Conference, and we see the first Utah Older Scouts Conference from 1924. And of course, all this is backed up. We also see an article from the Arizona Republican newspaper that Arizona got in on the act in 1924, and they did an Older Scouts Conference as well in 1924. Is there a patch from that Older Scout Conference, like from California and Utah? If there is, nobody's ever seen it. Could be out there. It's 100 years old this year. It ain't getting any easier to find. Also in 1924, the patrol leader conferences are going strong. We see patrol leader conferences in San Jose, California, in Pasadena, California, in Marysville, California, and many other cities during the year. These events have no insignia that I'm aware of. But let me just say this. When we get to a spot where we don't think there's any insignia, as we have and will continue to, if you find insignia from any of these events that are documented, you need to contact me right away and tell me how much you want for it, and we'll make a deal. More patrol leader conferences, Salt Lake City, Ogden, Utah. Ogden, Utah had a couple of different conferences in the same year. Scouting, of course, was huge in Utah. And it was officially adopted by the Mormon Church, as everybody knows, and they had one of the strongest programs going back. 1925, we take a look, and we're starting to see some more patches. The Golden Bear patch from Pasadena was the Southern California Older Scout Conference, and Salt Lake City also had an Older Scout Conference. Now you see on the Salt Lake City patch, you see UOSC, and that stood for Utah Older Scout Conference. Carry on is a common saying in Utah, used all over the place in different circumstances, along with their state motto, the Beehive State. And we're also seeing, for the very first time on the right, we're seeing an OSC, not a UOSC. So the OSC was an Older State Conference that was put on by the council, not the state. And so in 1925, Utah has a statewide Older Scout Conference, and Ogden Council put on its own Older Scout Conference. And they issued patches for both of these events. Mind-boggling stuff. These I know everybody always likes to know, well, how many of these are around? What are they worth? And I'm just as interested in that as you all are. Don't have good answers as far as the Golden Bear, the California Older Scout Conference. I'm aware of 4, maybe 5 of those around. I've never seen one sell. I've had 2 of them over the years, and I've got them both from people that actually attended the event. As far as the Utah stuff is concerned, these may be unique. These may be the only examples known as we speak. I don't know. From 1925, I also have more stuff that helps sort of fill out what was going on at these conferences. And I got my first 1925 Older Scout Conference patch from a guy in my council who went to it, and that I knew as a kid. His name is William Van Slyke. or Bill Van Slyke. We're going to see his name come up quite often. He is from my council, Crescent Bay Area Council. He is the best, most significant collector, scout memorabilia collector there ever was. And our council has produced some pretty good scout collectors. But he was the best. He saved everything. And his mother was really into what's called scrapbooking. Maybe some of you are familiar with that term, scrapbooking, the art of creating scrapbooks. And while he was doing all of his scouting activities, he was staff at Camp Emerald Bay in 1925. He went to the original Older Scout Conference in 25 in Southern California. And she would just collect all this stuff from him and put it in scrapbooks. And so they had stuff just like today's events. So we have a delegate card, we have lodging tickets from his scrapbooks. The meal tickets were missing. Obviously, he used them to get stuff to eat. But without this record, we would have no idea. And I know that paperwork isn't as exciting as patches and pins and medals and stuff. And I recognize that. But when you go digging, this stuff becomes just as interesting in its own way as the stuff we like to collect. And in the end, a lot of it is harder to find. It just doesn't exist anymore. Here's more fun stuff from Bill Van Slyke when he went to the 1925 Older Scouts Conference in Pasadena. That pine tree patch, that felt green tree on the left, it's still on the page from the scrapbook. And it was in there with the other patches and the other paperwork. This was his patrol patch when the scouts came to the Older Scout Conference. They were reassembled into patrols for the weekend. And the patrols were given insignia. Bill Van Slyke was in the pine tree patrol. Now, I know this is just a simple cutout of a pine tree, and I don't expect that anyone would get too excited about this, but it was part of his scrapbook. I love this windshield parking pass. How cool is that? We're talking Model Ts that had flat windshields, and they made parking passes that they taped to the inside of the windshield of these cars. Really get a kick out of that. The little decal sticker on the bottom, they had it all. They had the patches. They had bumper stickers. They had decals for the event. This was a full-on scouting kind of event, and it had stuff associated with it. We never see this stuff anywhere. If we take a look at Arizona, there's very little from Arizona, but by 1925, they were already on their second Older Scout Conference. And they did something that we start to see like Ogden did, where Ogden was a council that held an Older Scout Conference. And Tucson, they decided to have their own Scout Conference, Older Scout Conference. And they invited scouts all over Arizona. So it was a statewide event sponsored by Catalina Council in Tucson, Arizona. And that was different than the Older Scout Conference event sponsored by Roosevelt Council in Phoenix. The ribbon, the 1925 Arizona Scout ribbon, is the only piece of memorabilia that I'm aware of from Arizona from the 1920s. There's got to be more of it out there. It just isn't around. And more patrol leader conferences. The patrol leader conferences keep on coming. They're held everywhere. Here's in 1925, another one held in Pasadena, Salt Lake City. Honolulu holds another patrol leader conference in 1925. Arizona couldn't find anything in the research in the papers. Couldn't find it. 1926. Walking through this year by year, we're starting to see more stuff. The statewide Older Scout Conference for California was held in Richardson Springs, which is in Northern California, up near Mount Lassen. Hence, we have a volcano. To this day, this is one of my favorite patches. It's very simple, but how many patches do we have that are smoke billowing out of a volcano? I think this patch, was very, very popular with the people that earned it. And we're going to see more about this one later. Going back to Utah, we again have a UOSC, which would be Utah Older Scout Conference. And this time it's hosted by the Ogden Council, not the Salt Lake City Council. And they issued a button, not a patch. And Salt Lake City Council held a council Older Scout Conference. So Ogden and Salt Lake City switched the events that they held. One was statewide, one was for the council. Arizona held an Older Scout Conference in Bisbee. Bisbee, for those that aren't familiar with that part of the state, that would be southeastern Arizona, Douglas, Bisbee, a pretty remote area south of Tucson, near the border with Mexico. And for the OA collectors out there, this is the council, Victorio. It's a Victorio Cochise Council, where Lodge 177 was from back in the day. This is a pretty remote area of the United States. Taking a look at a picture here of 1926 at Richardson Springs. This image was sent to me by John Shaw as part of his collection. And it's another group photo. Wherever scouts get together, they like to take group photos, don't they? And the group photos always look the same. You got 100 or 200 little heads and bodies, and you can't see any of them. And they were doing that way back when. Richardson Springs is up near Chico, Mount Lassen area. We're going to take a closer look at this photo as it progresses, and take a look at this group of Sea Scouts over here. This caught my attention immediately from the entire group, one group of Sea Scouts, and we're going to check that out later on. We're going to get back to that. Now, also in 1926, the Patrol Leader Conference idea is sort of being taken to a new level by Tahoe Council. They're doing something that none of the other councils did. And while they were a little bit late to catch on to the idea of doing a Patrol Leader Conference in their council, once they got involved in it, they really got involved in it. This newspaper article on the left talks about how it was one of the council's objectives. They had a meeting in May of 1926. The council leaders did. They set out the council objectives for the rest of the year. And one of their objectives was to actually have a Patrol Leader Conference. And we're going to see how that ended up playing out. What we see is that the council is going to send people to the Older Scout Conference in 1926. They're going to send scouts to Richardson Springs, and those scouts are going to come back, and they are going to be the leaders of the Patrol Leader Conferences in their council. And then that's exactly what they did. But they had it all thought out. Again, this is just another example of when you start digging around in these newspapers, you find stuff that lays stuff out about what their thinking was and how they went about doing things that you can't find anyplace else. In 1927, this is what we have at the moment from Older Scout conferences going on in 1927. On the left, the council in San Gabriel Valley Council decided to hold its own council Older Scout Conference. This baggage tag says it's their first Older Scouts Conference, and it probably was. And this baggage tag is the only piece of memorabilia that I'm aware of. I'm not aware of everything, to be sure, but this is the only thing that I have seen that documents that event. Also, 1927 was big for the region because the region decided to break up the California Older Scout conferences. Instead of having one for the whole state each year, they decided to have three. They would have a Northern California, they would have a Central California, and they would have a Southern California Older Scout Conference. And so the Northern California Conference was held at Lake Tahoe. We see the patch there. The Central California and Bay Area was held at Oakland at Camp Diamond in the Bay Area. And the button, the green button that says Section 3, goes along with that Older Scout Conference that was held in Oakland, California. Down on the bottom, we see a pin from Bill Topkis's collection of an Older Scout Conference in Utah from 1927. It's the only thing that exists from that event. And we only have newspaper records of other events for 1927 from Utah, from Arizona, things that they were doing, events that don't have patches, baggage tags, bumper stickers. There's nothing. We just don't have it from some of these. And in Utah, though, it's interesting. Utah seems to have stopped holding Older Scout conferences in 1926. I don't know why. There's no record of it after that in the newspapers. The patrol leader conferences are still cooking in 1927. And Tahoe's got its thing going. They're going to have their conference. Other Tahoe gets their thing going, and they put out a patch. And so this appears to be the very first patrol leader conference patch, and it's put out by Tahoe Council for 1927. There weren't a whole lot of people that attended this event. But what I like is take a look at that center newspaper article for just a minute and go all the way to the bottom. And on the bottom, you see that it's highlighted. It says delegates to the conference will be presented with a felt emblem. I can't tell you how rare it is to see a newspaper article that makes reference to a patch from this period. The newspaper articles almost exclusively talk about the program and the names of the people that went. So this is a real score to find in a newspaper article documentation of the patch. Carrying on with 1927, we see patrol leader conferences in Santa Barbara, Berkeley, Fresno. Again, they're still being held statewide. I don't know of any patches related to them. In 1928, we have these patches available to us that are known. The Southern section, they would hold their Older Scout Conference in the spring in April. This is the one held in San Diego at the Indian Village in Balboa Park in San Diego. The Tahoe was the central section. That Tahoe patch is one, even to this day, to me, is one of just the most beautiful patches I've seen. And to think that it's a silk screened on felt that's approaching 100 years old, unbelievable, the way they did that. And then in the Bay Area section, they decided to change the name. They were tired of Older Scout Conference. So they decided to call their thing the Grizzly Camp instead of the Older Scout Conference. And they put out a patch that said Grizzly Camp. patrol leader conferences are still happening, and Tahoe is doing all kinds of stuff. If you take a look at the news article on the left, look at the bottom that's circled over there. This is from March 1928. It says quite a number of the conference sleeve emblems have been mailed to the delegates already registered. It said that in the newspaper, that they had this patch. That's unbelievable. And that they mailed them out to the registrants. I'm sure it was just one per registrant. And so they have the 28. More information about the direction the patrol leader conferences are going. And Tahoe wanted to have another one. They wanted to have another one at the end of the year, and they planned it. And at the last minute, they had to postpone it. There was flu, people were sick, they couldn't hold it there, whatever the deal was that was going on. In 1929, the Older Scout Conference down in Idlewild, which is in the mountains in Southern California, and then the northern version of the Older Scout Conference, Calaveras in the High Sierra, no patches known. And then after 1929, the interest in the Older Scout conferences started to decline. There's fewer newspaper articles, less stuff going on. The conferences turned from being educational events held in hotels to snow camping events. And so you start to see these newspaper articles for Older Scout conferences where they're actually calling the event a snow camp or a snow conference. It was a different kind of deal than it had started out to be. In Tahoe, in 1929, they're doing their thing. They took the patch that they had for their conference in 28 that got postponed. They redid it in like March of 1929, and they used the same patch. And miraculously, they didn't have a date on the patch. The patch had they had mailed out these patches and then postponed the event. And then Tahoe held another patrol leaders conference late in 1929 and issued the red circular patch on the bottom. Also from 1929, when we take a look at it, we have some additional information that has come with some of these patches, and I love this group. The photo on the right, I don't know the name of that scout, but when you blow up the picture, you can see he has all 4 patrol leader conference patches sewn onto his sleeve. It's pretty amazing. And then also a dinner ticket to the patrol leader conference dinner. I like these tickets. I like these paper things that go along with the patches. They just add to it. And then the patrol leader conferences continue on in Mendocino County. There's a 1930 from Fort Bragg. This is not North Carolina's Fort Bragg. This is California's Fort Bragg. And then also on the coast in Arcata, which is near Eureka, California, in the northern part of the state, in 1931. There's another patrol leaders conference. And after this point, the news on these events declines. You don't see the articles in the newspapers. They just started going out of favor. The Scouts weren't as interested in them. They'd been going on for 10 years or so annually. And people started to lose interest as well. Near where I live, there was a small patrol leaders conference in 1932. That's just walking distance from where I'm sitting right now. I'm not aware that they made any insignia or any patches about it. And by 1933, older Scout conferences and patrol leader conferences were dead. They had run their course. They weren't being used anymore. And the following year, in 1933, Region 12 introduced an all-new event for all the councils called the Camporals. Scouts were much more interested in camping, much more interested in competition than they were in training conferences. That was more like going back to school. And so the Camporel was the idea that really set off the 1930s and into the 1940s in Region 12. All right, so here we are. I'm going to pick up where we left off. We talked earlier about coming back to a particular slide that I want to share with everybody. And that's this panoramic photo of the 1926 Older Scout Conference in California. And you can see we have this area with the yellow box around it. When I got this photo, and I got the photo less than 24 hours before the presentation went on. I got it from John Shaw from his collection. And we've all been either in some of these giant panoramic photos or we've seen them. And after a while, they kind of blur together. And they do for me too. You just have hundreds of tiny little faces in a giant panoramic photo. But I was looking at this, and I was looking at this group of Sea Scouts. They kind of stuck out like a sore thumb on this panoramic photo. So I figured, okay, wow, group of Sea Scouts, I think I'll blow this up. And I blew it up and I started looking at it. And when I started looking at it, I thought, I can't believe this. These are guys from my council. I recognize their pictures from 1926. You've got the Camp Emerald Bay director of the camp, Barner Bates. We've got the scout executive over on the right-hand side. And I had no idea my council had sent a contingent of Sea Scouts to the 1926 Older Scouts Conference at Richardson Springs. And I was looking at the photo, and I could see on the shoulders of each of these guys, they had the 1926 Older Scout Conference patch on their Sea Scout uniforms. It stood out. That's the green volcano felt patch that we showed earlier on for the 1926 Older Scouts Conference. And as I started to look closer, I not only saw the patches on their shoulders for the event, but I saw this fellow on the right-hand side who wasn't wearing a Sea Scout uniform. And I looked at it, and after blowing it up, I go, wow, I know who that is. That's Bill Van Slyke. That's where I got a lot of these things that I showed tonight from his collection. Unbelievable. And it was such a surprise. I'd never seen this before. And as I looked at it, and I looked at Bill Van Slyke, and I noticed he had something, he was sort of leaning over, and he had something resting on his knee. And I thought to myself, what is this that's resting on his knee? And then I thought back, and I remembered that several years ago, I found an item on eBay that I bought randomly. And what it was it was a little notebook from the 1926 Older Scouts Conference. And I'm looking at this photo, and I'm thinking, I can't believe it. Got a picture of him holding this little notebook from 1926. And here's the notebook right here. And sure enough, it had the sticker for the Older Scouts Conference from 1926. It has his name, William Van Slyke, written in pen. And here I am looking at it all these years later, almost 100 years after the fact, on just sort of a random deal. And that was a Twilight Zone moment. I can tell you right now, looking at these pictures. And you never know what you're going to find in one of these panoramic photos. So tune in next time for next episode of Patch Tales Unknown.